Welcome to Shadows of Tinseltown, where we explore the real stories that the studio system tried to bury.
You see this, Maggie? This is the problem with the Golden Age narrative. We treat men like Mickey Rooney as if they were carved out of wholesome American oak, when in reality they were held together by frantic energy, studio-mandated amphetamines, and a desperate need to never stop moving. Look at his eyes in this 1939 headshot. That isn't joy. That's a man who hasn't slept in 3 days because the studio owns his circadian rhythm. He wasn't a person. He was a 24-hour utility, a high-yield asset for Lowe's Incorporated. He was a machine that turned Benzedrine into box office receipts. He was the primary engine of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and they ran him until the gears were stripped bare.
Wholesome is exactly the word I'd use, though. I mean, Andy Hardy? He was the boy next door. He was the kid every mother wanted their daughter to marry. He represented a safe, small-town America, Carvel, Idaho, that everyone was nostalgic for even then, especially with the Depression and the war looming. It was a fantasy of stability. Are you telling me the judge's son had a rap sheet?
Not a rap sheet in the legal sense, perhaps. But the boy next door was actually a 20-year-old man in a child's body who had already been married to Ava Gardner and was losing his shirt at the racetrack. Rooney wasn't a boy. He was a relic of vaudeville, shoved into a suit that was too small for his ego. He'd been on stage since he was 2, Maggie. His father, Joe Ewell, literally put him in a tuxedo and gave him a cigar to puff on when he was a toddler to get a laugh from the drunkards in the front row of a burlesque house. He didn't have a childhood. He had a series of bookings. By the time he was Joe Ewell Jr., he had already learned the most terrifying lesson a child can learn, that if the applause stops, you starve. He was trained to equate silence with death. The energy you see on screen wasn't passion. It was a Pavlovian response to the fear of being irrelevant before he hit puberty. It was the frantic dance of a boy who knew that the moment he sat still, the circus would leave him behind in the dust.
It sounds like he was less a human being and more a ventriloquist's dummy for his father's ambitions. Was he even Mickey Rooney then? Did he have a choice in the name?
Choice? In Culver City? Don't be naive. He didn't even own his own name. He started as Mickey McGuire for a series of shorts based on a comic strip. When the series ended and he tried to take that name with him to bigger studios, the creator of the strip sued him. The court essentially ruled that Mickey McGuire was property, not a person. He had to legally change his name to Mickey Rooney, just to own his own face. And even then, MGM took out an insurance policy on his youthfulness, as if it were a factory piece. If he grew an inch too tall, or his voice dropped too deep, he was technically a defective product. They were literally monitoring his pituitary gland for the sake of the quarterly earnings. Can you imagine the horror of a growing boy fearing his own biology? Every time he felt a growth spurt, he wasn't becoming a man. He was becoming a liability to the board of directors. They treated his puberty like a manufacturing flaw.
It's like a fairy tale where the troll owns your name, and you have to keep dancing to get it back. But the Andy Hardy films, 16 of them, they weren't just factory pieces. They were the moral glue of the country for a decade. People loved Judge Hardy. They loved the man-to-man talks in that wood-paneled study. There was a sense of order there that people clung to while the rest of the world was falling apart. It felt like a blueprint for a decent life. Was that all a fabrication, too?
Those talks were the PR cover for a 7-year contract that was essentially a mortgage on a human soul. While Mickey was on screen, playing out the morals clause, He was vibrating with nerves in real life, thinking about his mounting debts or his next fix. Louis B. Mayer was the ultimate ventriloquist. Mayer didn't create a star. He managed a manic-depressive cyclone that had been spinning since the Coolidge administration. He saw in Mickey a way to sell a moral code he didn't actually believe in. Carvel wasn't a place. It was a psychological cage. Whenever Mickey got too wild, which usually just meant acting like a normal 20-year-old with too much money and a penchant for fast cars, Mayer would drag him into that cavernous office with its white carpets and its massive desk designed to make everyone else look like a dwarf. Mayer would weep. Literally weep. He'd tell Mickey he was killing the judge, his fictional father. He weaponized Mickey's own lack of a stable father figure to keep him in line. It was emotional blackmail on an industrial scale, played out under the portrait of George Washington. Mayer was the father who gave you candy with one hand and a suicide pill with the other. He turned the sound stage into a confessional booth where Mickey was always the sinner.
A cyclone? That sounds aggressive for a guy who did Let's Put on a Show musicals with Judy Garland. I always saw them as this perfect, innocent duo. 2 kids with a dream, a barn, and a trunk full of costumes. It's the ultimate Hollywood fable. It felt so organic, so American. They were the MGM kids, Richard. They were the crown jewels.
Organic? Maggie, it was as organic as a refinery. You realize they were both being fed pep pills, Benzedrine, to keep them filming for 20 hours a day, and then downers, barbiturates like Seconal, so they could sleep for 4. It was a chemical seesaw, a pharmacological tightrope. The studio doctors were essentially high-priced dealers with MDs, keeping the MGM kids in a state of perpetual, jittery productivity. That bright-eyed look in Babes in Arms, that's his pupils dilating under the influence of speed. It's not a musical, it's a medical chart.
And Judy? Was she on the same regimen? It's heartbreaking to think of them together like that. They were like 2 children trapped in a beautiful, gilded clockwork.
Worse. She was on a starvation diet of black coffee and cigarettes to keep her looking like a child, while Mickey was on a speed-fueled sprint to stay vibrant. They were 2 thoroughbreds being whipped toward a finish line that didn't exist. They shared a common trauma that no one outside Culver City could understand. They were the only ones who knew what it felt like to be a god at noon and a wreck by midnight. Every "let's put on a show" sequence was actually a desperate attempt to ignore the fact that they were being worked to the bone. They weren't singing for the audience. They were singing to keep from collapsing. If you look closely at the dance numbers, the timing is perfect, but the eyes are vacant. It's the precision of a high-functioning addict. They were bonded by the fact that they were the most famous laboratory experiments in the world. They were the first generation of manufactured adolescents, prototypes for the pop stars we see today.
So the let's put on a show energy was actually just a high? A studio-mandated euphoria?
A high that lasted 15 years. Rooney was the biggest star in the world from 1939 to 1941. Bigger than Gable, bigger than Tracy. But he was essentially a state-sponsored child laborer whose growth was stunted by the very industry that worshipped him. In 1939, they even gave him a miniature Oscar, the Academy Juvenile Award. It was a toy trophy for a man who was already supporting half the studio. They gave him a miniature statuette, Maggie. Think about the symbolism. Even the Academy refused to recognize him as a man. It was a marketing gimmick to keep child stars from asking for adult pay. Mayer used to lecture him on purity and the sanctity of the American family, all while the studio was literally poisoning his blood for the sake of the quarterly earnings. The hypocrisy wasn't a bug. It was the architectural foundation of the studio. They treated their stars like livestock, valuable, but ultimately replaceable once the meat went sour. And for Mickey, the meat went sour the moment he tried to be a man.
So the energy, that manic, bouncing off the walls quality, that wasn't just showmanship? Was it all just drug-fueled terror? How did he even keep his identity straight if he was constantly being told who he was by a committee of writers and producers? He must have felt like a ghost in his own skin, watching Mickey perform from somewhere deep inside.
It was survival through performance. If he stopped moving, the audience might notice he wasn't 5'2" out of charm, but out of sheer biological exhaustion and a diet of cigarettes and stimulants. He was a professional kid, well into his 20s. Think about the psychological toll of that. Being 30 years old and having to play a high schooler because the public refuses to let you age. Imagine the dysphoria of looking in the mirror and seeing a man with a man's desires, but the world only pays you if you act like a petulant boy who needs his father's permission to go to the prom. He was a caricature of himself before he even hit 30. He had been so many Mickeys, McGuire, Rooney, Hardy, that I doubt he knew which one was real when the lights went out. He was a collection of scripts bound in human skin. He became a man who could only communicate through bits. If he wasn't doing a voice or a face, he was invisible.
And the women? You mentioned Ava Gardner. That wasn't just a fling, was it? That was the ultimate rebellion against the Andy Hardy mask. How did he hide that from the factory?
It was a collision of two different worlds. When he married Ava, who was effectively the personification of adult, smoldering desire, Mayer was livid. Not because he cared about Rooney's heart, but because it broke the Andy Hardy illusion. They forced him to hide the marriage for months. They forced him to keep playing the virgin, while his real life was a whirlwind of gambling, late-night brawls, and the racetrack. He was a man with a child's reputation and a man's appetites, and the friction between the two nearly burned him alive. The public didn't want to know that the boy next door was spending his nights drinking scotch and arguing with a femme fatale. It ruined the brand, and in Hollywood, the brand is the only thing that has a soul. He was a prisoner of his own success, locked in a nursery that was increasingly smelling of stale gin and broken promises. The more he tried to act like an adult, the harder the studio pushed him back into short pants.
I read somewhere that he had 8 wives. That doesn't sound like a man who was stunted. It sounds like a man who was, well, a bit of a predator, or just incredibly lost. Why would anyone keep going back to the altar 8 times? It's almost pathological.
Lost is the more clinical term. He was looking for the mother he never had, or perhaps the audience he was losing. Each new wife was a captive audience of one. Every marriage was a comeback of sorts, a way to restart the narrative when the previous one became too painful to bear. He was a man who couldn't stand silence, because silence meant he was alone with the ghost of Joe Yule Jr., the kid in the tuxedo who wasn't allowed to cry. Have you ever noticed in his films? He's never still. He's always fiddling with a hat, always mugging for the camera, always doing a double take that lasts 3 seconds too long. He was terrified that if the spotlight moved an inch to the left, he'd disappear into the shadows of his own height. He was 5'2", but he lived a 12-foot life, and the interest on that debt eventually came due, in the most humiliating ways possible. He was a man who needed constant validation just to feel three-dimensional. When that validation faded, he began to crumble. He didn't know how to exist without a lens focusing on him.
And then there was Breakfast at Tiffany's. I saw that recently, and I couldn't even finish it. The performance was grotesque. It felt like he was desperately trying to be funny in a language he didn't understand. Why would a man with that much talent agree to do that?
Grotesque and racist. His yellowface performance as Mr. Yunioshi is rightfully loathed today, as one of the most offensive caricatures in cinema history. But look at it through the lens of a forensic archivist, Maggie. Why did he do it? It was a symptom of that desperation. He was 60 years old and terrified of being forgotten. He would do anything, even something dehumanizing and culturally destructive, just to stay in the frame. He couldn't say no to a camera. A camera was the only thing that made him feel real. If a director told him to jump off a bridge for a laugh, he wouldn't ask why. He'd ask if he should do a flip on the way down. He had no internal barometer for dignity, because he had been a commodity since he was in diapers. In vaudeville, if the audience laughs, you're a success. It doesn't matter if they're laughing with you or at you. By 1961, he was just happy to have a call sheet. He was a craftsman who had spent so long building a facade that he'd forgotten how to build a life.
But he did go to war, didn't he? He served in World War II. I thought that was his moment of growing up. He won a Bronze Star for entertaining troops under fire. That has to count for something in the detective's ledger. He was actually out there in the mud, not just on a soundstage. He saw the world outside of Culver City.
The war was the beginning of the end. He went away a superstar, the king of the world, and came back to a world that had seen real horror. The gee-whiz antics of Andy Hardy felt like an insult to men who had seen the frozen hell of the Ardennes or the beaches of Normandy. He came back to find his throne occupied by the likes of Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift. Men who mumbled, men who bled, men who didn't care if the audience liked them or not. Brando didn't put on a show. He just was. He brought the method, a raw, uncomfortable truth that made Mickey's vaudeville mugging look like a dusty, desperate relic. The audience didn't want the boy next door anymore. They wanted the man who had been through the fire. And Mickey didn't know how to be a man. He only knew how to be a character. He was a dinosaur watching the meteor hit, and the meteor's name was authenticity.
So the world outgrew him while he was away fighting for it. He became an anachronism at 25. That's a brutal realization to have in your prime. To realize that the very thing that made you a god is now the thing that makes you a joke.
Exactly. Rooney was still trying to tap dance over the cracks in the floorboards while the rest of the world was watching the floor cave in. He tried to reinvent himself, but he couldn't stop the mugging. It was hardwired into his nervous system. He was like a vintage radio trying to play a jazz fusion record. The technology just wasn't compatible with the new era. The minute that boyishness curdled into something middle-aged and desperate, Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. He went from the top of the world to filing for bankruptcy and doing dinner theatre in the blink of an eye. He became a punchline before he was even 50. Imagine being told at 40 that the only thing people liked about you, your youth, is gone forever, and you have 50 more years of living to do. It's a prison sentence of irrelevance. He spent the last 4 decades of his life chasing a ghost that looked exactly like him at age 19. He was a man who won the Academy Award for achievement, but died without the money to pay for a headstone. He occasionally showed flashes of brilliance. Look at Requiem for a Heavyweight or The Black Stallion. But they were ghosts of a talent he was never allowed to nurture.
You're describing a man who was famous for being a child, but was never allowed to actually be one. He was stuck in a loop of perpetual adolescence, and the world just kept demanding he do the old stuff. It's almost like a horror movie, the eternal boy who can't stop dancing while his skin sags and his friends die off.
It is a horror movie. He lived to be 93, outliving almost everyone from that era. But look at his final years. It wasn't just a quiet retirement in a mansion. He was testifying before Congress about elder abuse, claiming his own family was stripping him of his dignity and his remaining pennies. He had made billions, with a B, for the studios and his managers over 7 decades, yet he died with a net worth of $18,000. Think about the scale of that theft. They took his height, they took his name, they took his blood, and in the end, they took his pocket change. He was the ultimate cautionary tale of the studio system. A man who built an empire on his shoulders and wasn't even allowed a seat at the table when it was over.
18,000? After a century of work? That's not just a bad investment. That's a robbery. It makes the Golden Age look like a crime syndicate with better lighting. It makes you realize that the glamour was just a thin layer of gold leaf over a mountain of misery. The detectives usually find the body, Richard, but in this case, the body was still walking around, doing dinner theater and signing autographs for $20 a pop.
It's a systemic execution. The crime scene isn't the scandal of the marriages or the gambling, Maggie. Those were just symptoms. The noise made by a man trying to feel alive in a vacuum. The real crime is the studio system's long-term effect. They build you up as a god. They use every ounce of your marrow to sell popcorn. And when the public's taste changes, they leave you to starve in the wreckage of your own celebrity. They don't give you a pension. They just give you a new prescription and a smaller dressing room until you're small enough to disappear entirely. Mickey Rooney didn't die in 2014. He died 1,000 times every time a director said, "Cut," and the lights went out, leaving him in the dark. He was a man who performed until the very end because he didn't know how to exist without an audience to validate his pulse. If no one was watching, he wasn't sure he was there. He was a phantom of the Vaudeville circuit, searching for a stage that had been torn down 50 years ago.
I think I need to re-watch Babes in Arms, but I don't think I'll see the boy next door anymore. I'll see the man behind the curtain, trying to remember what it was like to not be on stage.
History is much more interesting when the heroes are allowed to be as messy as the rest of us. It's more honest that way. It's the difference between a fairy tale and an autopsy. You can't understand the Golden Age until you're willing to look at the blood on the tap shoes and the pill bottles in the dressing room. If you want the truth, you have to look past the marquee and into the shadows where they kept the secrets.
Thanks for watching until the end.
Have a good day.
Bye.